I need you to go and set up the tags and description and everything for the live stream.
Sure.
In this video, I'll show you how to set up
Check.
In this video, I'll show you how to set up
Check.
And starting now.
I think so. Starting now. Starting now? Yeah, starting now. Okay, we're live. All right. So, brief explanation of what this is all about. We're just going to be doing a watch party of John Vervaeke's lecture series on the meaning crisis. I want to make sure everything is working here.
And then we're going to be doing a discussion. So for the first hour, we're just going to watch the video, and then we will discuss.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is kind of an excuse for us to watch the content, because it's like, how many hours of content is this?
Oh, it's going
It's
to
like
be
almost 100 or something like that.
Yeah, it's going to be when it's done.
Yeah.
I think he's released like 30 of them now, David?
Yeah.
I think you know.
36.
36.
He's got
yeah.
36 of them out now. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there will be 50 of them in this.
50, okay.
Cool. Sounds like you got a bit of a house party there, David. Just when we get
Yeah,
the
it's
discussion going, if you want to throw on some headphones, that'd be great.
I think that's Georgie.
Oh, is it? Georgie. Mute.
All
I
right.
think me and Georgie are fighting to mute right now. Okay, you're muted. All right, I think we can just jump into it. I won't waste your guys' time here, so let's just do it. Now I have to find one of my 1,000 windows. All right.
Isn't it right there?
Where?
Right there?
No, that's not it. Okay, I might have to just research for this. It's all right, little...
Technical glitch.
Yeah, well, no, it's a human error. Not used to this live stream thing yet. Okay.
UV, are you going to do a notes document again?
Yes.
Did you pull that up and put it in the chat just so that if people want to take notes as we're going?
Yeah, there's going to be
Yes.
a persistent URL for that too, which is futurethinkers.org/meaning crisis notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm going to paste that into the Zoom as well.
Yeah, thanks for remembering that. Okay.
So yeah, that's futurethinkers.org/meaning crisis notes.
Oh, by the way, guys, if you want to participate in the chat, there's a YouTube chat going on here as well. So that will actually show up in the stream itself.
Yeah.
Which I think people are already participating there.
Mm-hmm.
Okie doke. Here we go.
I don't hear any audio yet.
Oh, that's a great start.
You don't hear audio.
I know what that is, actually. This is what happens when I'm jet lagged and I'm trying to... Oh, you just signed me out, that's why.
Oh.
All right. You just missed the music, don't worry. There you go.
Welcome back.
Can everyone here?
I'm John Vervaeke, and this is a video series on awakening from the meaning crisis. So last time we were beginning our historical examination of the origin of this capacity for meaning making to try and get a clearer picture of what it is. And today I'd like to continue on with that. We were talking about the connections between meaning making, enhancing cognition, altered states of consciousness, wisdom. And we were talking about that in connection with the Upper Paleolithic transition, in which human beings seem to have gone through this radical change, which was not so much a biological change, but a change in how they were using their cognition. We talked about important ideas such as cognitive exaptation and psychotechnology. And we talked about how the Upper Paleolithic transition was probably driven by the way shamanism was a set of psychotechnologies for altering states of consciousness to cognitively exact the enhanced abilities that trade rituals and initiation rituals and healing rituals had already been creating. And we talked about the way the shaman engaged in various disruptive strategies to try and alter their framing of reality, because how we frame reality is both the source of our adaptivity, our ability to find patterns, but it is also how we can get locked in, or how we misframe reality, and how we are in need of insight. And when we talked about that in connection for something like that, the 9-dot problem. And that led us to realize that there's kinds of knowing that are independent from the knowing that we capture in our statements of our beliefs. There's knowings about knowing how to do something, what it's like to have a particular perspective, and what it's like to know something by identifying with it and participating in it. And I was starting to show you how the shaman's altered state of consciousness was also enhancing and altering meaning making, affording insight, and improving the ability of the shaman to help in hunting and healthcare, two things that would radically improve survival. I want to continue now in talking more about that, and more about what's going on in shamanism, in order to get more explication of this meaning making, wisdom, altered states of consciousness, different kinds of knowing, and how they're all interrelated together. So typically the shaman engages in practices that are putting significant changes in their attention. As we mentioned, there's often significant disruptive strategies: sleep deprivation, sex deprivation, social isolation, the use of psychedelics, extended chanting, all of these, dancing, all of these things are designed to bring about radical changes in the way in which the brain is operating. Now, part of what a shaman is doing is, I would argue, also getting into the flow state. So the flow state has become something that is discussed both academically and in the popular culture. It was made famous in work by Csikszentmihalyi. His book, Flow, The Flow Experience, brought it to the forefront in 1990. So what is the flow experience? So the flow experience is an experience people get into. They often describe it as like being in the zone. So you are involved in a task that is very demanding. In fact, it has a particular structure to it. So these are your skills, and these is how demanding the situation is, right? And the flow state is one in which the demands of the situation just slightly go beyond your skill abilities. Right? And so you can get what's called here, Csikszentmihalyi often represents this by the flow channel. Right? When my skills can just through, we'll talk about this, through like sort of insight and restructuring, when I can just enough exact and extend my skills to meet the demands, so I have to put everything I've got into it, then I get into the flow channel. If my skills exceed the demands, I fall into boredom. If my demands exceed the skills, all right, I fall into anxiety. Now, of course, the thing about you is you're very good at learning in situation. So you need a kind of context in which your skills, as your skills improve, your environment also improves. So one of the things we've created in our culture, we have created flow induction machines. Because what those machines have are a situation where your skills are constantly improving and the demands of the environment are constantly improving. And these flow induction machines have other properties that are very important in them. There's a very tight feedback between what you do and how the environment responds. You're getting very clear information, and failure matters. It's like, at least symbolically, because you can die. And of course, some of you are probably realizing that I'm talking about video games. Video games are one of the most reliable ways of inducing the flow state in people. In fact, part of the reasons why video games are addictive, and they now are being considered to be a bona fide addiction by the World Health Organization, is precisely because they engender the flow state. Addictions, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about addictions, addictions run off machinery that is evolutionarily adaptive. That's why it's compelling. So, the flow state. What are other things that people do to get into the flow state? They play jazz. They do martial arts. I'm a martial artist, right? One that's particularly interesting, because there's no other explanation for why people do it other than they get into the flow state, is rock climbing. Because rock climbing otherwise would be like, it's like some sort of torture from Greek mythology, right? You presented like, here's a rock face. What I want you to do is I want you to go up that. It's going to be really physically demanding. It's going to hurt you. You might fall to you and harm yourself. And once you get to the top, you come back down. It would seem like a torturous thing to do. Well, we know why people rock climb. They rock climb because they get into the flow state. And the flow state is deeply, deeply positive for people. It's not the same thing as physical pleasure, right? In fact, the flow state is much more connected to meaning in life. In fact, the more often you get into the flow state, the more likely you will rate your life as meaningful. The more you will experience well-being. Now, what's interesting also about the flow state, and remember we're doing this because I'm talking about that shamanism is probably a practice for practicing getting into the flow state, so remember that, right? The thing about the flow state, it's a universal. People across cultures, socioeconomic groups, genders, language, environments, age groups, report being able to get into the flow state, and they describe it in detail almost exactly the same way. That's a universal. And universals are important in cognitive science. You pay attention to the universals because they give you profound insight into the machinery. What's it like to be in the flow state? Well, when you're in the flow state, right, you feel like you're deeply at one with things. So, for example, I'm a martial artist, and when I'm sparring, it's like my sense of connectedness to my opponent is really enhanced, and I'm really at one. And that comes with it this kind of spontaneity. So when a strike is coming toward, my hand is just there. I don't sort of raise your hand now, John. It flows out of me, hence the word, right? And the block is there. The hockey player, the goalie, just puts out his hand, the glove hand, and the puck is there. There's this tremendous sense of at-one-ment. And then closely allied to it is this, right? At one level, you know, like the shaman dancing or chanting, that there's tremendous metabolic energy at work, effort. You're making, at one level, all this effort, but at another level, it feels effortless. That's this spontaneity. Again, it just seems to flow from you. Your sense of time is passing differently. Your sense of self is being dramatically altered. So when people are in the flow state, right, their a kind of self-consciousness disappears. That self-conscious, you know, we carry around that self-consciousness that's always doing this sort of thing. It's constantly sort of doing our autobiography. How's my day going? How am I doing? Who am I? What am I doing? Blah, blah. And it's also checking. How do I, image management. How do I look? What are people thinking of me? How am I doing? Am I under threat? All of that nattering and, oh, am I failing? I knew, and that, you know, of course, and that can get out of hand. And like when you're in depression, you ruminate on all that stuff and it overwhelms you. But we all carry that burden around. It's taxing. And the thing in the flow state, it's gone. Because there's no space for all of that. Because you're so, right, engrossed in the task. And the other thing about the flow state is it's super salient. It's like the kind of brightness and vividness you get in a video game. The world seems more intense. And people really like this experience. And not only do they like it, it seems to be where they do their best work. So the flow experience is an optimal experience in two ways. Many people regard it as the best experiences they can have, but it's also where they're doing their very best at what they want to excel in. That's why it's so motivating to get into the flow state. So, Why is the flow state so good? So this year, 2018, I published some work with Adrian Hare-Bennett and Leo Ferraro in which we tried to argue for what the cognitive mechanisms are in the flow state. See, Csikszentmihalyi tells you the environmental conditions, what you need in order to get into the flow state. You need skills and demand to be matched. You need there to be very tight coupling between you and the environment, like in the video game. You need very clear information. It can't be ambiguous or vague. And failure has to matter. It has to be costly to you in some fashion. He specified all of that. He also specified the kind of training that helps enhance you to get you into the flow state. And think about this. Think about what I said last time, and we're going to explore this more. Training in mindfulness, the more people have training in mindfulness, increases their capacity to get into the flow state. Now, can we come up with a unified explanation for all of this? I think we can. Both for the phenomenology, why we're experiencing what we're experiencing when we're in the flow state, and why is it improving your cognition? And therefore, why would the shaman be enhancing their cognition by getting into something like the flow state through their ritual practices? Okay, so think about the rock climber. Okay? The rock climber is climbing. Remember we talked about how you frame and find patterns last time. Remember the 9-dot problem, right? And that these patterns aren't just patterns in your mind, they're patterns in knowing how to make sense of things. So you're rock climbing, and if that breaks down, you impasse, you're stuck. And I don't mean just cognitively, you're physically stuck. Now, if you want to be a good rock climber, what you have to do is you have to break that framing. You have to train yourself to break the frame, restructure, change what you're finding relevant and salient, and then change yourself to fit that, and then you refit yourself to the rock face. You refit yourself to the rock face. Then you have to do it again. And then you have to do it again. And then you have to do it again. Or the jazz musician. The jazz musician is playing, they pick up on a pattern, they play with it, but they can't stay with it too long. What do they have to do? They have to shift, they have to restructure, they have to shift into a new pattern and then play with that, but they can't stay with it too long. They have to pick up on it, they have to reframe again and again and again and again and again. Do you see what's going on with the rock climber, the jazz musician, the martial artist? Is this idea of a cascade of insights. You're having an insight that's leading to another insight, that's leading to another insight, right? It's priming. So, you know when you have like an insight, you have like, aha, and you get that sort of burst of energy, and it's like a flash. That's why we put a light bulb over somebody's head when we want to show them having an insight. There's like that flash. Now imagine if I took that aha and I extended it. Aha. That's the flow state. It's an insight cascade. So the more you flow, the more you're training your ability for insight in interacting with your environment. Now the trouble, of course, with the video game is the environment isn't a real world. But in the shaman's world, of course, the shaman's flowing in the real world, the real social world, the real ecological world. But there's something more. It's not just an insight cascade that's going on in flow. That in and of itself would be great. But there's something else going. And this has to do with your capacity for implicit learning. Now notice what's happening here. Notice that although even I'm doing the history, I'm always also doing the cog sci. Because while I'll be emphasizing the history, the historical account, I'm starting to build what I need to give you the structural functional account. Okay, so implicit learning. This goes back to work done in the 60s by Arthur Reber and a whole bunch of other people. So what Reber was doing is he was originally trying to understand how people learn language. What he was doing was he was generating an arbitrary set of rules, completely arbitrary, just make them up on the spot. set of rules for how you can link strings of letters and or numbers together. Like the rule might be you can't have more than 3 vowels in a row, or you have to have 2 consonants, and then you generate letter strings. 8, 9 long. These are so long that you can't sort of easily hold them in your working memory. And then this is what you do. You can generate an indefinite number. You generate a huge number of these strings, and you just show them to people. Here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. Okay, that's the first part of the experiment. Then you do the second part of the experiment. Now you generate a whole bunch of strings, but 2 kinds. One set of strings is generated by that artificial set of rules, and so follows the same rules as the first set. And then the second set is generated by a completely different set of rules. Okay? And what you do is you mix up the first and the second together. And this is the task you give people. Can you tell me the strings that belong with the strings you saw before? There you go. Now, Reber originally thought what would happen is people would, because it seems like so random. What he found was people score well above chance consistently on this. People can tell you, oh no, those strings, yeah, those belong with the old ones. No, that one doesn't. That one does, that one doesn't. Now here's what's interesting. You now ask people, why? How do you know that? And they'll give you one of 2 answers. They'll say, I don't know. I don't know. I just feel it. Which is, ooh. Or they say, they give you some explanation. They'll give you some rule or procedure they're using, and here's what we know. They're deceiving themselves or lying to you because that rule that they're using wouldn't actually predict their success. So you are picking up, you have this tremendous capacity outside your conscious awareness, right, to pick up on very complex patterns in your environment. And you say, okay, why? What does this have to do with shamanism? Well, hang on, because we talked about the shaman picking up on patterns last time. Let's go back to this. Let me talk about an experiment that's really interesting. So there was some work done on this idea, that people have psychic abilities, and there's the feeling of being stared at. People can tell when they're being stared at. And people reliably report that they think, oh, I knew somebody was staring at me. I could just feel it in the back of my neck and stuff like that. And so they ran an experiment in which they did the following. They'd have somebody in a room, blindfolded, earplugged. They can't sense anything. Nobody's allowed to wear perfumes or anything. That person can't see or hear or feel, and they're just standing in the room. Unbeknownst to that person, people would come in and stare at them. And then they had to report if the person at the center of the room had to report if they were being stared at or not. And people were reporting this well above chance. They were saying, I think I'm being stared at. And there was somebody there. And of course, first of all, they was, ooh, right. But then it turned out that if you made a slight change to that experiment, it wouldn't replicate. So what was going on? You bring people into the room, and they say, I think I'm being stared at, and the researchers would tell them if they were correct or not. They would say, you're right, or you're wrong. So what? You say, so what? Well, here's the thing. The researchers thought they were introducing people, the viewers, into the room randomly. But it turns out they weren't introducing them randomly, because you know what's very hard for you to do? Random stuff. They were actually introducing people as viewers in a complex pattern. And the person that was blindfolded and earplugged was implicitly learning the pattern because they were getting feedback. If you take the feedback away, if you don't tell them, whenever they say, I'm being stared at or not, if you don't tell them whether they're right or wrong, their performance drops to chance. See, a lot of what looks like psychic abilities are your ability to pick up implicitly on complex patterns in the environment without being aware of it. So, Hogarth, in his book on educating intuition, makes a really cool claim. Makes a very good argument, in fact, I think, for this. He says that what we call intuition is a real thing, but there isn't anything sort of magical about it, like the psychics say, or something like that. Your intuition is the result of your implicit learning. You pick up on all kinds of complex patterns, not knowing how you have done that, but you get an ability to detect patterns, and you don't know how. That's why your intuition feels the way it does. You just sort of know. Like, you know things, you're doing it all the time. To use a famous example from Dreyfus, you know how far to stand from somebody. And what angle to like where you should stand, how close you should stand, what angle you should stand, how, as the conversation or the context changes, you're allowed to move closer or farther away, what angles you're allowed to be at. But if I were to ask you to tell me how you do that, you wouldn't know. You would just say, I know how to do it. And yet, when people don't know how to do it, it creeps you out. It creeps you out. Okay, so intuition. Now, Hogarth points out, and this is something very common, right? Hogarth points out that, you know, we have two different terms and we don't realize we're talking about the same thing. We have intuition when we think it's going well, that implicit learning, but we also have bias and prejudice for when we think that implicit learning goes bad. The bigot has got intuitions about races that are wrong. Now, how is it that implicit learning goes wrong? Well, here's the thing. You have some complex pattern in the environment, right? And your implicit learning picks up on it. The problem is there's two kinds of patterns in your environment. There's correlations, there's correlation patterns, and causal patterns. Now, what do I mean by that? Correlations is when any two things are related to each other. So let me give you an example of a couple of correlations that you shouldn't confuse with causation. There is a correlation between how large your wedding is and how long your marriage will last. If you have a bigger wedding, your marriage will last longer. Now, you would be a fool to therefore think you should have the biggest possible wedding. Because the reason why bigger weddings predict longer marriages is not because bigger weddings cause longer marriages, is because, right, they're only correlated. It's because bigger weddings reflect a bigger social network, more financial resources, and having a bigger social network for the couple, having more financial resources, actually does cause a marriage to last longer. Here's another one. So I'm old enough, right? And I was brought up in a religious household that I was, you know, when prayer was taken out of the schools. And of course, people were very upset about that. Look at crime is going up as we've taken prayer out of the schools and things like that. By the way, crime hasn't been going up. Read some of Steven Pinker's work. But let's say it was. That's only a correlation. Because here's another correlation. We know that greenhouse gases have been going up steadily. And that's part of the environmental crisis we're going to talk about. You know what has been also consistently going down for the exact same time period? Caribbean piracy. Having pirates in the Caribbean and wooden ships with cannons and stuff. As that went down, greenhouse gases went up. Now, I hope none of you think that we could solve global warming by bringing back piracy. Okay? So there are many things there are many patterns in the world that are illusory because they're only correlational. They're not causal. See, the bigot has picked up on correlational patterns, not causal patterns. So what you want to do is you want to train your implicit learning to pick up on the causal patterns that are real rather than the correlational patterns that are illusory. Now, here's what you can't do. You can't tell people to look for patterns explicitly. Go back to Reber's experiment. If you put people into that experiment where they're looking at the letter strings and you tell them explicitly what they're supposed to do, try and figure out the rules. Consciously, deliberately try to figure out the rules. Their performance doesn't get better. It gets worse. Okay? And Hogarth notes this in his book on educating intuition. We can't replace implicit learning with explicit learning because it is precisely by being implicit that it works so well. What can we do explicitly then? What we can do is set up the right context, the right environmental factors, so that my implicit learning machine will tend more likely to get onto causal patterns rather than correlational patterns. So I'll get good intuition rather than bad intuition. How do you do that? Well, Hogarth says the way you would do this is the way you do science. You want to control the context, right? Because what science is, and you know, there's a lot of science. Look, science is a way of distinguishing causal patterns from correlational patterns. You set up an environmental situation so that you can distinguish the causal patterns from the correlational patterns. Well, what do? Well, in an experiment, first of all, I make sure that everything is very clearly measured. I get very clear information. Very clear information. I make sure I'm looking to see that, right, that the change in one variable is closely followed by a change in another variable. So I change your drug dosage, do your symptoms get better? Right? So I look for clear information, I look for clear feedback, and in science, failure matters. You test a hypothesis, and disconfirmation has to be possible. Failure matters. Now notice this. What Hogarth says is, well, what I want to do is I want to put you into an implicit learning situation where you get clear feedback, like you do in science, where there is a tight coupling between what you do and how the environment responds, and where error really matters, like in science. And he says what we should do is we should try and do implicit learning in those kinds of contexts. Well, here's what myself and my colleagues argued. Those three criteria that will turn your intuition into good implicit learning are exactly the conditions for flow. Clear information, tightly coupled feedback, and error matters. The rock climber is looking for needs clear information, tightly coupled feedback, and error really matters. That context really means that there's a much greater chance that their implicit learning machinery is going to pick up on causal patterns rather than correlational ones. So, notice what we've got going on here. The shaman is getting into the flow state. He's developing all these techniques for getting into this deeply immersive, comprehensive flow state. And they're getting an insight cascade, and they're also getting enhanced implicit learning, picking up on very complex, real complex patterns. Now this is intuitive. They don't know how they're doing it. Now here's what's interesting too. These two are reinforcing each other. Because the insight gets your cognition to explore for new patterns, and then the implicit learning picks up those new patterns. And then those new patterns enhance your ability to restructure, and then, right, you keep exploring for new patterns, acquiring the new patterns through implicit learning, and you keep ratcheting your skills up. Getting into the flow state is deeply, deeply enhancing of your cognition. Somebody who's an expert at getting into the flow state is going to be an individual you want to have around. Now that individual is going to have some really serious challenges facing them. They don't know how they're getting a lot of the information they're getting. They don't know why they're so insightful. They don't, and they're experiencing this radical at-one-ment with the world, this loss of sense of self, when they're enacting the animal, right? You have to understand, these insights aren't verbal insights. Like in the 9-dot problem, it's not words, it's not beliefs. It's getting an insight in how the deer moves. It's getting an insight, an intuitive insight in how to talk to this person, to trigger the placebo effect, to help them to heal right now. So, getting into the flow state, notice what's going on here. Notice you're getting something that's almost like a mystical experience. It's a powerful altered state of consciousness. It's enhancing your cognitive processing, And the shaman is making meaning. They're singing, they're dancing, they're telling stories, they're altering people's sense of what matters, they're altering people's sense of identity, they're healing and transforming people. What does that mean? Why would that have powered the Upper Paleolithic transition? Well, first of all, this is enhancing your cognition. And this goes towards the work of Michael Winkelmann and also Matt Rossano. What's happening in this state is your brain is learning to get areas to talk to each other that normally don't talk to each other. This is especially the case if you've gone through a massive disruption strategy, fasting, social isolation, taking psychedelics. Because if you look at a brain scan of somebody who's having a psychedelic experience, areas of the brain that normally do not talk to each other are talking to each other now. Now, if I was just to do that to you, if I was just to get areas to talk to each other, you'd experience that as noise. But if you've got enhanced insight and enhanced intuition, those areas are now talking to each other, and you can bridge between them. You can connect them. And now this is an ability you take for granted. You think it is just the normal part of your cognition. This is your capacity for metaphor. The word metaphor is itself a metaphor. It means to bridge, to carry over, to connect things that are normally not connected. And what you need to understand is how pervasive metaphor is. I showed you a little bit last time, the idea of a project. But I want you to reflect now, and notice the word reflect is a metaphor, on how your thought and language is filled with metaphor. By the way, that was a metaphor. I'll say, for example, do you see what I'm saying? Do you get my point? Do you comprehend it? Can you grasp it? Do you understand it? These are all metaphors. I'm about halfway through this talk. I hope it's not too hard for you. Do you see? It's pervasive and profound. All of your cognition, this is work done by Lakoff and others. I have some criticisms of some of their theory, but the idea that your cognition is filled and functions through metaphorical enhancement, that's just, I think, the case. Now, why is metaphor so powerful? Because metaphor is how you make creative connections between ideas. Metaphorical cognition is at the heart of both science and art. When the shamans are enhancing this machinery, they're connecting areas of the brain that normally didn't talk to each other and affording a massive enhancement in metaphor. One of the ways in which your cognition and meaning and altered states of consciousness come together is in how your mind, your embodied mind, is generating metaphor in order to make insightful connections. There's a deep connection between how insightful, how good a problem solver you are, and your capacity for metaphorical thought. That's why when somebody is facing a problem and they need to restructure how they think about it, we tell them to use an analogy, to think of a metaphor. So, this is the point. The shaman is developing psychotechnologies for altering the state of consciousness to get into the flow state. And that flow state is already making them more insightful and more intuitively powerful, but it is also making them generators of metaphor. literally providing people with the forms of thought that will allow them to connect ideas, such that making inscriptions on a piece of bone can track the moon. Carving this figurine can connect me to ideas of fertility. So we're seeing a lot of the themes that we're going to develop coming to the fore here. How much, right, the shaman is weaving together, enhancing cognition, altered states of consciousness, and improving our capacity for making sense of the world, literally making more meaning. If you're a hunter-gatherer group and you have a shaman, you're going to outcompete groups that don't. There's a reason why it's universal. There's a reason why the flow phenomena is universal. Because this exapts some of our most basic machinery, enhances it in a powerful way. Now, the shamans have a very interesting kind of experience. They go through this transformation. They often experience what's called soul flight, as if they've gone to another world and they're flying through it. This is the origin. I mean, think of how we've come to this. But this is the origin of getting high. When the shaman does this, the shaman experiences themselves as if they're flying above the world. Why? Why would the brain generate that? Well, think about this. The shaman is getting a much more comprehensive grasp of more complex patterns, but they're experiencing it mostly intuitively and metaphorically. Where are you when you get a bigger picture of things? You're above them. How do we often explain this even to ourselves metaphorically? Right? You have oversight. Somebody who is in charge of things has oversight of them, or has supervision of them. Do you see that? Those are metaphors. Those are metaphors that are little whispers, little echoes of shamanic flight, flying over things, getting an intuitive, insightful grasp that is expressed metaphorically of a deeper connection to the world. We're going to pick up on all of these themes as we investigate more the machinery of meaning making. But I need to move forward now, because I want to talk about another revolution. This was the Upper Paleolithic transition. This is where the meaning-making machinery, the altering consciousness, the self-transcending, the flying above, the cultivation of wisdom, associated with a lot of things that we consider spiritual and religious. You see them all together. That's the Upper Paleolithic transition. Now there's another important revolution that takes place around 10,000 BCE. That's the Neolithic Revolution. You get the invention of agriculture. Now, agriculture is important because it adds to this machinery in an important way, because now individuals are part of complex societies. And for the first time, because of agriculture, people start to stay in one place for significant amounts of time. So their relationship to the environment, to each other, because they're living with large groups of strangers now, and to themselves, radically changes. That goes through a very long period of development. This world, right, of course, then becomes the ancient world, as stone gives way to metal. And we get the Bronze Age, the period of the first great civilizations in Mesopotamia, in Egypt. And there's a transformation that's happened in the way people are experiencing their world. Human beings are still doing everything we've been talking about. They still have rituals. Of course, they've developed them into very sophisticated, complex systems. They're still engaging in altered states of consciousness. And that world is pervasive for a very long time. But our connection to it is very odd. So if I were to ask you if you've read anything from the Bronze Age, chances are you haven't. Have you read the Epic of Gilgamesh? Well, no, probably not. Right? Have you read any Egyptian mythology? Probably not. Why? The Sumerian, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian civilizations are titanically important, long-lasting. But notice, if I ask you if you've read parts of the Bible, or perhaps Plato, or perhaps some of the Buddha or Confucius, chances are you have read some of that. You somehow feel that those people are relevant to you in a way that people from the Bronze Age aren't. Now why? There seems to have been another great change, comparable to the change of the Upper Paleolithic transition. Again, whether it's a one shot or more continuum, again, I don't need to decide that, and I'm not confident that the debates around that are actually very fruitful. But Carl Jaspers talked about the axial age. Karen Armstrong has made famous that in a recent book. So around 800 BCE, to around 300 BCE, there's this great change, such that you will read, connect to, find relevant authors, systems of thought, ways of being from that time period, and yet back here, where the Bronze Age ends, you don't read this stuff. In fact, or at least most of you don't. You don't find it relevant. You don't identify with it. Something happened here that is formative of us. Just like the Upper Paleolithic transition was formative of us as human beings, the Axial Age is formative of us as Western civilization, or at least world civilization. Because it's not just in the West that the Axial Revolution occurs. It also occurs in India and China. Now, what happened? Why this change? Well, there's a bunch of stuff that happens. We don't quite know. There's a lot of discussion about it. But we know the Bronze Age collapses. There's some good books by this. There's a book by Drews. There's a book by Klein, 1177 BCE. Right? Different discussions about why it collapsed. Was it a change in chariot warfare? Is it general systems failure? Is it a combination of change in military technology? Don't know. Doesn't matter for our purposes. What we know is that it's a collapse. Now you need to grasp the gravity of this collapse. This is the greatest collapse in civilization the world has ever known. The fall of the Roman Empire is nowhere near as devastating as this. More cities go out of existence at this time, the Bronze Age collapse, than any other time in recorded history. More cultures disappear. Greatest loss of literacy, greatest collapse of trade. This is the closest thing the world has actually experienced to apocalypse, the end of the world. What happens here is a dark age. So you had, before this, you have these, like the Egyptian Empire, these titanic dinosaur empires, huge and powerful, lasting for centuries, cultures that last millennia, and then they disappear. And what you find, right, is something like when the dinosaurs went extinct. When the dinosaurs went extinct, the little mammals that had been sort of scurrying about, you know, they start to evolve. What you have once these dinosaur empires pass out of existence in the Dark Age is you have a lot of little small-scale societies, people barely hanging on. It's a very tough time. Another time in which there's a demand made on cognition to adapt. Remember the bottleneck in Africa preceding the Upper Paleolithic transition? Here's another bottleneck kind of event. So people are more willing to experiment, to try new things than they have before in the past. They're willing to try new forms of social organization. But importantly, they start to invent new things. And they start to invent new psychotechnologies. Remember last time we talked about what a psychotechnology is. It's a standardized way of doing information processing that improves and enhances your cognition by linking brains together. Your brain to your own, future states of your brain, your brain to other people's brains. Something happens here in one of the areas that was hit hardest by the Bronze Age collapse. The area Palestine and what's modern Israel and Jordan, places like that, used to be the old, referred to as the land of Canaan. What seems to be invented here is a new kind of literacy. Remember we talked about literacy as a powerful psychotechnology. Now the Bronze Age world had literacy. The Egyptians had hieroglyphics famously. The Sumerians had cuneiform. Now the thing about those forms of literacy is they're very difficult to learn. You have to go to school for a very, very long time. And your job, you could have this job in the ancient world. This was your job, to be literate. It's called being a scribe. It's where we get words like scribble from. All you were, your entire job was you were literate, because it was a tough thing to be literate, and it was a very valuable thing, and it was a rare thing. Because literacy was hard when it's ideographic. So I have some ideograms tattooed here, right? This means meditate, right? What gets invented here is alphabetic literacy. Right? Sort of, it seems to be invented in Canaan, and then it's taken up by the Phoenicians, and then they take it to the Greeks. And then the Canaanite alphabet merges imperceptibly into archaic Hebrew and then gets taken into Hebrew. That's going to be important. These two groups of people are going to be very important. Now, why is alphabetic literacy so powerful? It's much more learnable. It's a more effective and efficient psychotechnology. Remember when I said last time how much literacy enhances your cognition? If I give you alphabetic literacy, you can learn it much more powerfully, and more people can learn it. So your ability to learn and access and share with others the benefits of literacy gets magnified tremendously. And so the amount of people, the number of people that can be literate expands. Now, literacy does something very, very important. Really, really interesting in its effect on your sense of self and your sense of cognition. As I noted before, when I can write things down, I can come back to my thoughts later and I can reflect on them. I start to become more aware of my own thoughts. And notice something else I can do. I can correct my thinking more readily, because I don't have to rely on it being held in my mind. I can put it, I can externalize it, I can put it out there, I can reflect on it, I can correct it, I can store it independent of my memory. So I start to get a capacity for what Robert Bellah calls second-order thinking. Now, we all have metacognition. We'll talk about this later. Metacognition is your awareness of your own mind. I can ask you right now, what are you thinking? You can become aware of it. Do you have a good memory? Yes or no? And you'll say, I do or I don't. That's metacognition. It's your knowledge and awareness of your own mind. We all have metacognition. But one of the things you can do with literacy, alphabetic literacy, is you can internalize literacy into your metacognition. So notice I'm becoming aware of my own cognition here. I can reflect on it, I can correct it, I can enhance it, I can store it, I can share it with others. Second order thinking is when you internalize a psychotechnology into your metacognition and it improves your capacity to critically examine your own thinking and correct your own thinking. Second order thinking starts to emerge because of alphabetic literacy. What else is being invented at this time? Well, you've got lots of armies moving around in this period, because what's happening is empires are being rebuilt, famously the Assyrian Empire in the Middle East. Mobile armies are needed. And so there's an invention here that's really important that we also take for granted, right? It's the stuff we carry around. Well, we used to carry it around. We don't carry it around anymore. We'll talk about that. It's money, coinage. Coinage is invented. Now, coinage is obviously a physical technology in one sense. I carry coins around, although the sense in which money is now physical is very, very tenuous, because most of us don't carry anything physical anymore. Money is just a purely symbolic thing. And that's the point. Money teaches you to think in an abstract symbol system. You start thinking in abstract symbol systems. And it also teaches you something else, numeracy. You have to start thinking mathematically, at least arithmetically. So you now have abstract, symbolic, logically rigorous thought being trained. It's being trained for practical purposes, but it's being trained. It's ready for exaptation. The alphabetic literacy is training this second order thinking. It's ready for exaptation. You say, okay, I get it. The psychotechnologies are training skills that are ready for acceptation. Well, bring that second order thinking and bring that abstract symbolic thought more logically rigorous together, and what are you going to start getting? You're going to start getting people having a very, clear sense of two things about their cognition. One thing is how much they can correct their cognition, how much they can transcend themselves, self-transcendence. It enhances their sense of self-transcendence. But what's it also doing? It's also enhancing their awareness of how self-deceptive they are, how much error is in their cognition, and they previously couldn't be aware of it. But now with second-order thinking, with literacy, and abstract symbolic thought and numeracy, they can become aware of this. Now you put those two together, a tremendous capacity for self-correction, a tremendous capacity for self-deception. And human beings start to do something very differently. They start to change their sense of self and their sense of the world. They start to realize a more personal sense of responsibility, which of course is going to change how people think morally about themselves. What do I mean? Let me give you a specific example. If you look before this time, Right? People think of chaos and warfare and violence as just part of the natural order. But after the Axial Revolution, with the advent of second-order thinking, with this increased awareness of self-transcendence and self-correction, people start to realize, no, 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 we're responsible for the violence. We're responsible for the chaos. Not just in some vague sense, but it's the way my mind makes meaning. That's why the Dhammapada begins, the mind is the chief thing. Right? People understand, they understand, and you see this in the Dhammapada, there is no enemy greater than your own mind, but there is no ally greater than your own mind. People start understanding this double-edged sword of their own cognition. Undisciplined leads to violence through self-deception and illusion. But discipline through self-correction and self-transcendence leads to wisdom and the ability to reduce the violence and the suffering. So in our next meeting together, we're going to talk more about this axial revolution and this sense that people had of their capacity for self-transcendence and their capacity for self-deception, and how that changed radically their sense of self and their sense of the world, and how that changed what meaning meant and what wisdom meant. Thank you for your time.
Hey, Mac, are we going to do something like a break again this time? We did that last week. Oh, I turned my volume down, I think. I bet we will. I'm curious. I know that we're in intermission time, so I don't want to get into real discussion. But I'm curious of the people who are on the call. How many have watched the Meaning Crisis series before? If this is a second time through, or are you aware of it, or is this a new thing for you?
Don't be shy. I see a lot of new people here who don't join our calls regularly. Come on, come on. Don't make me unmute you. Marin, your audio doesn't look like it's working. Maybe in the bottom left corner, there's a little arrow beside the mute button. I know you're unmuted, but you just gotta maybe select your input. The chat was quite engaged, it seemed like. It was awesome.
Still can't hear you, Marion. You can go ahead and work through that. I'll say this is the second time through for me. I just watched the series and got caught up through the current release of the video series, and just this is the second time that I've watched it just during this. And as I said in the comment on the YouTube stream, I'm amazed at how much there is in this thing. It blows my mind how much more there is, and so I'm really glad that UV's taking notes and that the document's there, because it's just like this is so rich. So much of it's just streaming through.
It's hard to wait for this discussion. Yeah, I'm really working on my process here. Like you can see my mouse, and I got windows popping up and shit throughout the whole stream.
I'm very grateful for your organized approach. There's a lot here. I'm a little bit afraid of the chaos, but it seems like so far it's manageable. This is just the second of the series.
Look at this.
I'm wondering how to handle.
Okay, so let's do. Oh crap! I accidentally switched it. Intermission's supposed to be. Switch that.
It is. I see it. Yeah, it's still 5:22.
Okay, so yeah, this is like the stream setup. So there you are, and I've got like this TV over here to like manage all of the chat and the document and the audio and the switching scenes and stuff. And then I've got over here making sure the stream is live, and then Yumi's down here taking notes. There she is right now. Yeah, it's just, I don't know, like switching constantly. But yeah.
Let
It's
me
working.
refill your teacup.
Thank you.
There we go.
I think you guys can hear us on the stream too. So the discussion will be hosted, if you want to jump into it on Zoom and actually participate. It will be at futurethinkers.org/watch, which I'm going to change that in the future, but for right now, that'll just send you to Zoom. If you don't want to participate, you'd rather just listen, maybe just jump out of the Zoom call to make it easier for us to manage, and you can watch it from the live stream because it's still up.
And the live stream is on YouTube.
Yeah, yeah. And the link for the live stream, if you guys are in the video chat right now, is in the Zoom chat. Teo says I'm ready for the next lecture already. I know, now that I'm into it, I just like, I want to watch them all back to back. Now I have to wait a week.
Mike, I'm curious, with all of the multitasking that you have to do to keep all that stuff going, are you able to really listen to the content as it's...
Not as good as I would like to, but it's only because I have to get this process working, and then once it's working, I'll be able to, you know, the next couple lectures, I'll be able to pay attention. But I'm the one in the chat on the live stream, so that's all right. I'm listening for the most part. Yuvi's hardcore though.
I'm the
Taking
notes
the
master.
Just another side note, there was somebody, and I don't remember the name of the website right now. Hang on a second. It is, there's a, romeresearch.com is I don't know if you guys are aware of Workflowy. Workflowy is kind of just a outliner type web tool for taking notes that I like, but Rome Research is something that it's gotten me thinking about different ways of taking notes collaboratively and cross-referencing things. So it's in beta, so they're not really ready for prime time, but there's something that this note-taking process and trying to coordinate thoughts together and really do kind of really thinking of what tools would be most effective for true collective intelligence has me really interested and curious about what we might develop over time in terms of requirements and thoughts about how to coordinate a group like.
I think the
10 seconds.
Okay, yeah. I think the blockchain industry actually has probably the most development in that area. Okay, transition. There we go. See you guys on the screen. Okay.
Discussion time.
All right. I'm trying to make this look all right with the chat. I think that's good enough. Cool. So yeah, again, if you don't want to participate in the chat, then just jump out of the Zoom call. That would be really great, and then we can just keep the amount of windows to a minimum. And you can, of course, just jump into the stream and participate in chat there.
In text chat.
And for you guys in the call, there is, if you go to the YouTube channel or the YouTube stream right now, and you see the chat on the right, you can click the little hamburger menu, the little ... and then go pop-up chat, and then just have that chat beside your Zoom window if you want to see what the chat's saying as well. So let's get into it.
There were
David, I want to pick on you first. What were your thoughts from this one?
Sure.
Unless you want to jump in.
I really liked, I loved, I had forgotten again how much he covers in such a short period. I was check too, did you want to record this? Or no, I guess it's streaming, so it's cool.
It is.
Don't have to worry about recording. Yeah, I was amazed at how much he covered here and how much of the core ideas were covered this early in the series. I mean, he kind of continues to unpack it over time. But I didn't remember that he had studied so deeply, and I certainly didn't have the deeper insights that I'm having this time, the first time through that I watched it. I'm sure of that. Also, just amazed at the number of books that he references, the amount of information that he's synthesizing, and really, again, appreciating the frame that he's using to filter this through, which makes it digestible. It really does help focus. Why is this relevant? Why is shamanism related to flow, related to learning, related to making sense of the world, related to making sense of the previous meaning crisis and all of that? So yeah, that seems pretty amazing to me that all of that comes together.
Yeah.
I'm a little blown away at the moment. I had quite a big brainstorm this morning before we got on the call, so I'm still kind of catching up to the. I'm just still like a little wordless in the moment. So I'm curious how the conversation's going to go. But I'm blown away. I'm really happy we're doing this.
Yeah, it's really amazing how he puts everything together, because I know that other people have attempted to articulate why flow states or altered states of consciousness are deeply meaningful and why they are transformational for people. But the way that he puts it together from this historical anthropological perspective and also later neuroscience and all of these different things, it's just so grounded, you know? It's grounded and it's practical. It's not kind of out there, and he doesn't make it sound like it's something that special people are doing. It's like, this is just enhancing normal human cognition and anyone can do it. I really like that approach. Because there are other books, like Joe Dispenza, for example, writes about this quite a lot, but it's very much like positioned as something special. But I really like that John Vervaeke specifically positions it as not special.
Here's the thing about it that I think is most amazing, and this is related to the brainstorm kind of that I had this morning, is what is powerful about this isn't so much content, right? Even though there's a lot of content here, it's much more about context. There's something that the way that he's engaging this topic creates a kind of flow state and making sense of this deeper resonance that's happening. I was intrigued watching the live stream chat that someone, when we were talking about bottleneck, said, "Oh, I don't see the bottleneck yet." And it's like, oh, I absolutely do see the bottleneck now. And I suspect that people do once that's pointed out, right? Oh yeah, this is what a bottleneck looks like. But also the fact that the Bronze Age collapse is so not known, right? It's that how super catastrophic that was during the time, and it's just almost completely disappeared from our collective memory. We don't know about it. It's not taught in history, and it kind of blows my mind that that's the case. I mean, we're, in some sense, that's the best example that we have for what might look like the collapse now, both in terms of understanding how it happened and what to do about it, how to prevent it or how to metabolize the process as we move through this. And the fact that it's not very well known seems shocking to me.
There's also this aspect of it of collapse and transformation being part of the same process. How this extreme pressure and, you know, whole societies collapsing actually opened up a space for people to experiment and create something new. And in the first lectures of the series, he also talked about another collapse that was the precursor to the previous upgrade in human cognition, where all of human population was down to something like 10,000 individuals. So we almost went extinct. And after that is when we see the emergence of shamanism and these psychotechnologies. So it's very eye-opening.
It's also interesting to look at the flow state as a part of this, that, you know, as he's saying, rock climbing isn't because it's pleasurable in and of itself. It is that mattering, that on the edge of collapse, that has our mind really open up and see deeper patterns and show up in the present moment. You know, the ego kind of disappears and something different happens. So I think that collapse as a flow state and instigator is an interesting frame that I hadn't really thought of it until just now.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Josh?
Yeah, I actually brought up, I was the one who said I don't really see the bottleneck. And what I understood from bottleneck is like the population civilizational bottleneck, just in terms of like the reduction in available resources and just coordinating. I mean, I definitely see like signs of stress in our society, but I've been reading a lot of Bucky Fuller lately and just abundance mindset stuff. So I'm kind of looking at like, oh, with the right information, we can kind of like have this abundance world. And I don't see like this population bottleneck necessarily happening, because it's, I mean, we're still growing. So I don't know. I just kind of wanted to comment on that, since that was my perspective on the bottleneck. So I don't know what you guys are thinking in terms of what bottlenecks you're seeing, but maybe we could dig into that a bit more.
Yeah, good idea.
I think there could be different kinds of bottlenecks, because the first one that John Vervaeke talked about was literally when the population was down to 10,000 individuals, and that was before the age of shamanism. So I can't remember the exact time frame. I think something like 70,000 years ago. And then the second one was the Bronze Age collapse. And I don't know if he specifically talked about the reduction in number of individuals, but a reduction in complexity, perhaps. So collapse of cities, collapse of empires, collapse of social structures. So I think that if we are to look for patterns of something like that happening now, it would be on a higher order level. So if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, it wouldn't be on the level of survival, and maybe not on the level of social structures, but it could be something like on the level of psyche. Like people just, and we're seeing this actually now, just how pervasive mental illness is, confusion. People just can't make sense of the world. Like Mike was at this conference just over the weekend, and people just like randomly broke down crying emotionally. Just like people can't handle their shit. And I keep seeing this over and over again.
Yeah. That person may be watching, so I would rather not
Okay.
dive into that.
Okay.
But yeah, there was definitely a theme at this conference of like grief and urgency, just over and over and over again. And people were doing speeches at the front and brought up Greta Thunberg. I don't know how to say her last name, and in all kinds of different contexts, but really continually referencing the sense of urgency that she's bringing up here. And it's quite scary that when people get into that mode of urgency, they start immediately looking for solutions without thinking quite deeply about what those solutions are. And it tends to be that they jump straight into, we need to hire someone to do the sense making and do the action for us. We need to get some benevolent dictator out there to take over and fix everything. And I mean, I can't count the amount of times through our podcast people have said we need to like make Elon Musk the global dictator of the world. And really all they're doing is outsourcing their sense making, their sovereignty, their agency, all of that. And so that's a big part for me of why I want to do these conversations, is just to, help people build their own sense making.
Yeah, I have a sense that this actually might be at the crux of this transition, where people learn how to have individual sovereignty, and not in a libertarian sense, like not in the sense of like, oh, I just do whatever I want and nobody can tell me. It's this deep capability to understand the world, to make sense of it, and to act appropriately without externalizing authority to somebody else.
Yeah.
I think for me, where the bottleneck idea sort of comes together for me is that it's your hierarchy, you're talking about relating to it, makes a lot of sense to me. It's something that comes on gradually, right? It doesn't just start with a massive population collapse. So there's always going to be people who enter it first in different ways. And like you said, some of those, maybe mental health is a really good example. I think physical health is also a big one. That's the one that I'm in, where people are grow up in a good situation with good parents and a healthy lifestyle, and their system is not like, our genetics aren't working in the environment that we're living in anymore, so that no matter what, you can follow all the cultural instructions growing up and arrive at a place in your life where you can't flourish. And that is new, right? Like that's not something our parents, for the most part, faced. So that's kind of where I see the bottleneck thing happening, where the cultural instructions of the past are no longer, like literally no longer providing any kind of safety net in which people can function going into the future.
There's no such thing as modern wisdom now. There's nothing that can be passed down from previous generations because no previous generation have experienced anything like this.
Yeah.
I mean, to answer the bottleneck question, I was curious as well, Josh, because I didn't, you know, I'm actually busy with the tech stuff and missed that part. But now that I think of it, it seems like it's referencing the pace of change and our biological ability to keep up with it, or our network ability to keep up with it in real meat space. Yeah.
Yeah, just Heather, your comment, and Mike, your comment. It makes me think of just when I'm reading Ken Wilber, he's like, there's like 1% of the people at any stage of development will make it to the next stage. So there's the pyramid where there's like only a very small number of people are at the highest stages of human development. So that's very much a bottleneck. And we kind of, I think we see here that like we're going to need a lot more people operating at higher levels of development to like thrive. So in that sense, there's a bottleneck.
I don't know if you guys are familiar, but Claire Graves is the person who developed the system that later became known as spiral dynamics. And that was actually part of his research. He was a psychologist, and he found that it is exactly pressure and kind of a personal collapse, I guess you could say, that triggers those kinds of transformations when the person's whole meaning structure and structure of making sense of the world no longer works, and it has to collapse, and then a next order emerges. So this framework that John Vervaeke is talking about, where these kinds of big bottlenecks or collapses produce the next stage of human evolution, Claire Graves noticed the exact same thing happening on an individual level. And that's why he thought that so few people make it to the next level, because it's like if there's not enough pressure, then there's simply no need to upgrade the cognitive software.
You know, Yuvi, I really like what you're saying about upgrading the cognitive software there. There's an idea that Vervaeke brought out here, which I really like, and I don't think quite got enough attention here, which is the idea of like externalizing our cognition. This is a really big idea in the cognitive sciences, which is that not all of our mental processing happens in our brain. Oh, yeah. So much of it we externalize into our environment, our memory, our processing. And I think like this is where the answer can lie to some of these questions is clearly our own cognitive systems are not advanced enough to deal with the amount of complexity in this world. Like we just, like one single human brain is just so pitiful compared to these massive problems that we face. And so I really like what he said about storing and reflecting on our thought processes with that second order cognition externally. And I was wondering what people thought about that.
Yeah, actually, this is a subject I'm really, really interested in. I've always been fascinated in like hive organisms like ants and bees. And there's this term I found, I forget which book it was from, but it's called stigmergy. And it's basically when agents interact with their environment and let the environment help them make decisions. And ants and bees have established a way that their colonies are developed by feedback mechanisms of like certain chambers in the hive might have more eggs or more food. And then it kind of executes this algorithm really simply in the bee or the ant, where it's not cognizing what to do. It's not making decisions about the entire whole structure of the colony. It's actually just responding to micro signals from the environment. And we're doing that in the same way. We just haven't had the chance yet to design that stigmergic environment so that we can respond appropriately without having to do so much sense making and thinking on our own. And so at this conference, it was in Kiev, and there were a lot of Swedish people there from Stockholm. And there was this massive group of Swedes who were from a co-living community. And it was about 50 to, I forget the exact number, but it was at least 50 people living in one giant house. And it's a big experiment that they're doing there, where they have really purposely designed the environment to be like the ideal human habitat, where people can, have really high level social interaction, but also be able to escape. They have like meditation rooms. They have, VR and gaming rooms and like a media lab, and they have multiple kitchens of different sizes and living rooms of different sizes so that you can have more of an intimate environment or a more kind of big party atmosphere. And this attention to detail in the environment is like stage one of stigmergy design for, I think, humanity. And it's a super interesting experiment. And they're now opening another one in Kiev actually right now. So I think this is only the second one that they've done, but it's called K9. I forget what else, like where you could find it, but you just look up K9 co-living on Google and you might find it. Super interesting stuff.
Yeah, you might like a paper by Clark and Chalmers called The Extended Mind. It's like a foundational paper on this idea. What you're talking about there with the environment, I think that's interesting. I'm actually more interested in the less physical aspects of it as well, such as the use of algorithms to kind of quantify our thought processes. Like there's one in the United States that was a learning algorithm that would assign parole to inmates or not. And what they ended up finding was that this algorithm was incredibly biased against Black people, and it was assigning them like much longer sentences and not releasing them on parole, and everybody got really upset about this. But then they released the algorithm, and it's like, hey, this was just learning about what decisions had already been made, and it was taking in the data that was already there. This is actually the way that our system already works. And it wasn't until that system was externalized and made explicit and codified explicitly that people started realizing just how much bias existed in it.
Yeah. That's one of the biggest problems of AIs actually is the inputs, figuring out which inputs to listen to. It's a huge, huge problem.
The point about externalizing something so you can look at it is really important. And that's the whole point of second order thinking, right? It's like being able to look at our own cognition, analyze it, tweak it, and then put it back in the box. So I wonder if there's something like third order cognition that we can develop where something like you said, where we, codify what's happening, and then we're able to look at it and see how it's flawed, fix it, and then put it back in the box.
Yeah, I think that's where we're headed. And the third order, I think, Eric, is very similar to what you're thinking. It's almost in the moment collective relevance realization, where it's not just even so much what I said previously, but how what you're saying is shaping what I'm seeing in the moment live. And there's something really interesting about this as well. There are, I think on the last call I mentioned back in 2005 or 2004 or so, James Vervaeke wrote a book called The Wisdom of Crowds. And I was really fascinated by that book at the time, and also recognizing that crowds are not always wise. In fact, there's a new book out fairly recently from Douglas Murray called The Madness of Crowds, or the Madness. And it's talking about intersectionalism and identity politics and all that part, how the crowd is mad at the moment. In both of those ideas, the wisdom or madness of crowds seems to me to be an issue of what Vervaeke pointed out in the last video and in this one. The machinery for relevance realization, the machinery for our intelligence and our intellect can be both mad and wise. And it actually is the feedback mechanisms and our ability to pay attention to them that directs whether we're mad or wise, and as well as some other aspects as well. So I think we're really at the crux, and I love what Vervaeke is doing in general to bring out the kind of the substructure of the mechanism that allows us to focus on what does this look like. This call itself, as I said, this call, as we're looking at this, is an example of this deeper looking at the structure, shaping the way we're thinking real time as we're exploring these ideas, and what part of history is more relevant to these questions.
Yeah.
It's this collective intelligence, as Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Greenhall often talk about, but not the kind of collective intelligence that we had before for example, in what's associated with communism or any of these other societies that used collectivist ideas. It's not about people's sovereignty being subjugated, it's about people's sovereignty being engaged while participating with others.
Can I ask that you guys use the live stream chat instead of the Zoom chat? You can pull up, again, I'll link to the exact location of the live stream chat in the Zoom chat. Just that way everyone can participate, because everyone sees it through the live stream.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do the same here. And there's actually a bunch of comments that we can maybe respond to.
Yeah, sure. You seeing anything interesting, Mike?
Not yet. It's too much to go back and forth, but we can continue the conversation and then jump in if we lose it.
Sure.
I really like what David was saying about the feedback mechanisms. And that's something that I know Daniel Schmachtenberger has talked about quite extensively, is how our current system just lacks a lot of really important feedback mechanisms. I think I was watching his video on like the war on sense making by Rebel Wisdom. He was talking to them, and he had really interesting points. Is just our current capitalist system just has so many externalities, because these feedback loops are just being sent out into this information, whatever you want, pollution is being sent out into the environment, and we're never measuring that feedback in any way. So I think like a big part of this is even what John Vervaeke was talking about. He's like, you have to have that coupling with the environment. You have to have that immediate feedback. It has to matter in order for you to make sense of the system. And it seems like a large part of what we need to do is figure out what types of feedback mechanisms we need to introduce into our society.
This is related to the point from this lecture where John Vervaeke is talking about how during the Axial revolution, through second-order thinking, people were able to observe their own capacity to create chaos and war and realize that they were doing it rather than seeing it as just something that happens in nature. It's related to what you're saying, but it's like a deeper realization of the same thing. We're externalizing harm, we're polluting our own earth environment, we're messing up ecosystems that are the substrate of our own existence. And instead of seeing it as just like, oh, well, that's just the way it is, we're starting to realize, oh no, actually, we are doing it, and there's something that we can do differently.
Yeah, there's the notion of collectively being able to see ourselves in the mirror, that we can, it's one of the things that I think is very interesting. What I've started to pay attention to are not so much the content, again, of the political debates and the things that are showing up, but what's the thing that's there? Like the Greta Thunberg thing is, that's obviously a hot button issue, but the back and forth between, no, she's saving the world, no, she's a puppet and her parents are doing child abuse. It's like the fact that seems to be the top level of it is hiding some deeper current, and it's kind of interesting in the context of collective intelligence and collective wisdom. What is it actually saying? It's amazing how tangled up in our notions this is, and I think this is actually the bottleneck that I'm seeing. It's a cognitive bottleneck of our ability to see something, and watching people argue one side or the other is just as fruitless as people watching people argue about flat earth type stuff. It's like, what's clear is that both sides are completely defending, just as Heather was saying, the old view of how to make sense. It's like I'm holding so tightly to the existing model of reality that used to make sense of the world, and the fact that I'm belligerent and combative about it is indicative that it's no longer viable. So that's the piece. It's like, I can't actually make sense from that perspective. I actually have to let go of that and listen more deeply. What is trying to be said here? What is it that's happening? I also just wanted to tie in, Eric, what you were, or not Eric, I don't know your name, the last person who spoke. But the sense of capitalism, in that talk with the Rebel Wisdom on the war on sense making, Schmachtenberger had talked about problems with capitalism 3 or 4 times before he said, oh wait, pause just a second, I'm just letting you know, I'm not advocating socialism. The economic system that I think makes sense is going to be something we haven't seen before. So don't get caught up on that. And there's something that I think is really powerful in this, and this is part of the brainstorm that I was having this morning, is that the conventional model within capitalism with intellectual property laws and the privacy and the competitiveness and this kind of me versus you, zero-sum outcome, is different from collective sense making in some way, that we're making sense of this together, sharing our information because we can be much more intelligent together than separate. But it's also not going all the way back to socialism where it's all just equal data, right? It's not just some commons that doesn't have any sense of tracking where the ideas come from. So again, looking at how can our technology enable us to, and blockchain, you're right, blockchain is a perfect example of ways to keep track of the ledger is public and everybody can see there. So you can see, for instance, who was on this call, right? I mean, there are ways we could build tools that you can see, yeah, these are the people participating in that call. And it's not the sense of inventing it. It's like, where did the idea start? Who started it? Well, we're collectively influencing each other so that the ideas are arising in all of our minds at the same time. This is an idea that's happening in more than one mind. So it's the idea of trying to say, attribute pure authorship to one person becomes untenable.
This, we actually discussed this at length yesterday in a Rebel Wisdom interview that I did when I was at this conference. There's a problem when we talk about integral theory of how does one transition up the levels. And in the case of the orange level or rational mind, I made the argument in this conversation yesterday that the rational mind in a lot of ways requires its own tools to deconstruct and show itself why it's not good enough, why it needs to transcend the models. And I think a big part of what it needs is to be shown that there is no binary solution to a lot of these more complicated problems that we're facing now. That like the desire to fit everything into that binary dichotomy is actually exactly the mindset that got us into the problems to begin with. That there are a lot more yes and answers or more higher dimensional answers. It's like, and this is brought up in one of our group calls recently, where someone asked the question, is capitalism bad? It's like, well, the resolution on that question is so poor, so small, and that is that desire for us to like filter up all this information into that yes or no answer. And I do, as a rational person and person that has always been based in that orange, like I've moved from it, but I still believe that you can simplify things down to a lot of yes or no answers. A lot of things can still be done that way, but the resolution is just far too low for most of these questions. And that's what the requirement is of having collective intelligence, is that we have more minds working on these problems to increase the resolution. There may still be binary answers somewhere in that, but we're nowhere near the resolution to see them.
I think what this brings up for me and sort of brings it all together is the binary, the intellect science, I think striving for that binary has discarded intuition, because intuition can be corrupted and see correlational patterns. Science discarded all intuition.
Yeah.
Including causal intuition. And so we lost that piece, and that was the societal, to have a society inflow, if you can have that, or a culture inflow, you would need to have intuition as an important element in your culture, causal intuition, those kind of patterns. And so those externalities Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about, or all of that stuff, doesn't, I think maybe doesn't happen if, I mean, I don't even know, like I'm kind of out in a thought here, but if a culture can exist with cultural level intuition, that you then don't have those kind of things happen, is what I'm trying to get at, I think.
What I would be interested to see is what are the exact sticking points when the collective intelligence comes to decisions like what happened at that college, Evergreen. I mean, that is an example of like a massive amount of people coming to a really wrong collective intelligence about what to do.
I'll respond to Heather there.
Yeah.
Vervaeke was talking about that in his talk, where he said you need to set up the right environment for intuition to be able to play a role. And if you don't have that initial correct environment with that high signal fidelity, then intuition can go horribly wrong. And I think that's what we're seeing in our society, though, is that we have so much noise with things like social media and so many people who are intentionally trying to obscure the view of what's going on to create their own advantages, that at that point, if you exist in an area with so much noise like that, intuition can become worthless because there's just too many variables, and you can always, like with your own like biases, you can always just latch on to whatever you want and find some sort of correlation. So I think like the really big thing here is making sure that we are setting up environments where we can have honest conversations like this one, where everybody is collectively trying to get towards the truth. And John Vervaeke talks about later is like the difference between relevance and salience, and I think that'll end up coming up later in these discussions a lot. So.
Yeah, and he also talks about
just to respond back to that real quick. One of the things that Brett Weinstein actually talks about in his course, in the talks that he talked about what happened with Evergreen, is he and his wife did carefully set up the environment within the classroom such that they could have that discussion. And it wasn't safety. It was specifically, we're going to touch on some unsafe things, but the safety is you can say whatever you need to say, just be respectful with each other. And it was in that place that it's interesting. It's not exactly intuition, but I think it is. I mean, he didn't name it as intuition, but it is being able to follow in the moment where your mind takes you, and the collective intelligence to do that. That all of the students who protested were not the students of Brett Weinstein and his wife. They were people that didn't have that agreement and did kind of result in a mob mentality doing that. Even so, it's kind of interesting because I've watched some of the stuff with Brett Weinstein since then, and it still seems that it's challenging in an environment where there is so much piling on. The madness of crowds can be seductive, even for people of high caliber who have the ability to be able to maintain that sense of safety in that public arena. You know, I can see even he's challenged at places, and Jordan Peterson seems to be challenged at places, and as well as a lot of these people. It's interesting to watch the way that the conversation seems to devolve a bit if the madness is too great. So there's something of but I think the thing that's interesting is I think that we can all recognize the madness. Well, maybe not everyone, but certainly Brett could be able to recognize the madness, you know. And I think what John's pointing out is some kind of the feedback mechanism of, okay, hold on a minute, where do we need to do more of what Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachtenberger called the rule omega, the assumption that if I disagree with you, you're intelligent enough that I ought to give you a fair listening before I just dismiss you out of hand. I think that's an important part of how do we create the right environment that allows for our intuition to be aired and be able to do this collectively.
And also the point about
I think there's
disruption.
an important element here, like building a resilient group, or just like making this collective sense, making resilient to the bad actors, like you said, Eric. Like there's people that are intentionally trying to distort other people's perceptions and intuitions. And a team that I'm working on right now, we're trying to be a flat, like equal organization, but we're realizing that like every single person has to be bought in for this to work. Like one person can totally throw everybody else out of whack and just like cause a thing to destabilize and collapse. So like it's not resilient at all right now, which it's hard. I don't know what the answer is, but
do you have any insights into the resilience of these types of structures or organizations?
The way I'm proceeding right now is just like being transparent and honest, and hoping that we can work through like disagreements and just like collectively agree to like part ways, or I don't know what it looks like. We're trying to feel through it right now, and I'm just thinking transparency and honesty is the right next step. So I don't know. Should have some developments next week.
I'm really interested in this, specifically because it's been mentioned so much. But the idea of anti-fragility, looking at doing something more than just encouraging resilience, which is stability in the face of chaos. It's actually, it's actually creating eudaimonic response to chaos. When one person starts to take it down, that the collective organism responds effectively to make sense of that. Like, oh, what is it here that if we're being taken off course, it means there's something that's worth considering, at least at some level. Like we're not hearing something that needs to be heard. I have a practice that I engage in called circling, and if you've paid attention to Rebel Wisdom, Guy Senstock started to be interviewed there, and he's talking about that to some extent. Circling is a way that we can listen more deeply to not the content, not the tone, but the subtext. What is it that's happening underneath the surface that has this voice feel like it needs to be heard in this way that can feel to the group adversarial? It's not the point on the surface that matters. It's like, oh, there's actually something under the surface that's not being heard. How can we make it safe for? And actually what I notice that in myself is when I'm doing that, it's actually me that's shutting down the more sensitive voice inside of me. The strident adversarial voice is my own internal guardian that's protecting some part of me that I see as weaker and needs protection. So if I can catch myself in that and say, oh, why am I so strident? Who in me feels like it wants to say something or doesn't feel safe? It's actually not the voice that's speaking up. I think it's one of the reasons that Greta is so interesting right now, because her stridency, her adversarialness is not speaking truly to the underneath. I mean, yes, it's the fear part of it, but it's not speaking the care part of it. In that moment, it's a different voice that we're hearing. It's a different focus. And it's hard, and it's tempting. It's tempting for opponents to attack for that reason, right? I noticed this is an interesting dynamic in personal relationships as well. If I get stuck on that surface level adversarial tone of the conversation, we're lost. But if I can bring curiosity back in by saying, okay, this is an indicator to me that I feel challenged. How can I listen to that challenge in a way that can let the deeper voice be heard?
And likewise in others, not responding to the surface level adversarial response, but trying to see what's underneath it, because people often get defensive because there is something tender that they're trying to protect. So what is that tender thing that isn't feeling heard?
There's something about this that I find to be worth pointing out here, which is the willingness of the group to sit through that and allow for those situations, the discomfort or the difficulty of the conversation to just unfold. Not every group conversation is going to be pleasurable for everyone. And I've noticed this tendency in like different types of groups. The group calls that we do don't really seem to have this. We've kind of worked through that. But there are other calls that we engage in that are like, there are tender subjects that just will not be covered, will not be moved into. And it's a matter of etiquette. That's how it's viewed. Like you never talk about religion, politics, that sort of stuff. It's rude to do that. But there's also this additional idea, which I think is a layer of how the previous couple of generations have been raised, which is this idea of fragility. Like, this will trigger something, this will make it worse, so we have to step away from it. But that's become so pervasive that we never get into anything, you know, most of us never get anything deep or difficult. And there's so much utility in having a group of people like this size looking at one person, you know, having a freak out and helping them, like, within the intention of being loving and helpful, help them work through it, but also provide a bit of resistance as well. You know, if their behavior is just not suitable for the context, or they're going up, you know, on some sort of rant or whatever, like that kind of resistance as well. And that's another thing that people are afraid to do, is like provide their own resistance.
I heard or I watched an interview with Jordan Hall this week where he said we're moving from scripted mode to improvisational mode, and that hit me really hard because I think that's what you're noticing. It's like, imagine a play of actors and suddenly the director's like, okay, put down your scripts, improv, and a bunch of people panic.
Yeah.
Like, you don't know what to do, and other people let go and fall into it, right? But until everyone's comfortable, it's going to be a rocky ride, and I think that is what's happening right now.
Yes, actually, I just saw a blog post by Venkatesh Rao from Ribbon Farm, and he was saying something similar. He said that it's the great weirding. So now the kind of glamour, what did he call them? Glamour organizations or something? Basically, the very polished kind of, you know, beautifully formatted, everything is like rounded corners, you know, including ideas as well. This kind of institutions are going to be collapsing or fading into non-relevance. And the things that are more raw, rough around the edges, experimental, kind of
Single
mutating
use.
in real time.
Single use. I mean, like one purpose. Like you were talking about the Soviet technology you brought up the other day.
Oh. Yeah, the things that are a little more rough around the edges are going to be more resilient to the times that we're living in now. And it made me think about how we often think about things that are weird and things that are mundane as kind of on polar opposites of the spectrum, but I actually see them as part of the same spectrum because they're both very resilient to change. Things that are glamorous and polished are brittle and fragile. They break down in chaos, but the things that are mundane and the things that are weird survive in chaos.
Well, it's interesting too, because I'm glad, Heather, that you brought up Jordan Hall in that context, because I've been thinking a little bit about his idea of simulated thinking, right? The polished things are simulated thinking. When the heuristic is actually providing value, you want to use that heuristic. And so we want to get as much value out of our heuristic. We don't want to reinvent the wheel every single time we need to do something. So that works as long as it's providing value. But at the point that we're getting to this kind of bottleneck, where the value system and the heuristics no longer provide the value that we need, where we need a kind of collapse in order to do a transformation into a new mode, we start to see the brittleness of the heuristic. And it actually becomes, that's where the combativeness comes from as well, that attachment to, I care about this thing that we worked so hard to invent, I'm not gonna let it go without a fight. And then I have to recognize, oh, wait a minute, okay, but this is now, it's doomed. So I need to switch from scripted mode to improvised mode and be comfortable in the improvised mode as well. It's an interesting, powerful way to see the way that we move into this next stage that we're gonna be moving into. And you know, shameless plug, but for you guys, this course is perfect in that, doing the kind of training for moving into that improvised mode and recognizing when is the heuristic no longer getting the kind of payoff that we expect. So it's a powerful moment that we're in, and Vervaeke is actually pointing out specifically the kinds of awareness that we need to have to be able to look at that, but it's not something that most of the people are yet aware of. So it feels like the chaos is catastrophic in an unwinnable way, right? There's not an excitement for most people watching the madness.
Chaos is also generative, you know, because it's where new things emerge from. And it's interesting that archetypally chaos is often associated with the feminine, because the feminine is the thing that births new things into existence. So in the same sense, chaos creates new things. We just don't know what they are until they come. It's like you don't know what kind of kid you're going to have until you have one, and then you're like, oh, you're this kind of thing. All right.
I wanted to just take a minute before we kind of wrap up here to ask some of the guys or girls who haven't had a whole lot of input here to just let, jump in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just reading last night David White's work, The Heart Aroused, Poetry in the Presence and Soul of Corporate America. And one of the things he talks about is how living systems are kind of a balance between order and chaos, and how ecological systems, when they're thriving, are kind of in the middle of those two things, and that it's kind of a conversation with chaos and creating what you need to survive in that moment. And I thought what was interesting about the talk that we just listened to was that once you create a system where you can see the causal patterns, you are able to create helpful metaphors. And I think that might be what we need in order to create the new sense making, is that the new metaphors that don't exist yet through the intuitive relating to the chaos.
I completely agree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We need comics, and I'd love to see the
Memes.
newspaper comic format come into play here. Just 3 frames to illustrate something.
Artists and poets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for that.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else who hasn't spoken to that wants to speak?
Yes, I'm not sure if my connection is good enough. Maybe you can give me some feedback on that.
You're just a bit quiet.
Okay. I will still attempt to speak. I'm really glad you mentioned the feminine before, and I think what I heard, so if I may link that to deeper listening.
Your audio is, actually, if you can, you'll catch up here in a second. But if you can mute your video, I think your audio will be better.
I can stop this video. All right, maybe try that one more time, because.
Okay, thanks.
Ooh.
Still not good.
Is it better now?
Potentially.
You can also type the comment in the YouTube chat, and then we can respond to that.
Yeah. Yeah, why don't you do that? That would be better. Carlos or Alan, anything?
Okay.
It's potentially a no. Oh, there we go, Alan.
Hey, hello guys.
Hey.
Hi.
Well, actually, this is pretty exciting to me, but first time joining this group, so it's to me it's so much information. But I was just raising the question if talking about the flow states. I remember some time like a life ago, I was very interested on neuro-linguistic programming and something called like a Silva's method, meditation method. I'm wondering if this is related somehow, or if this is still something considered as a valid way to get into flow methods, flow state.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's relevant to the fact that we haven't done a whole lot of mapping of the terms that would be useful in this conversation. I'm I'm not sure that I have an answer directly for you, but you do kind of cause me to think about a content piece that might be helpful for this.
Mm.
Anyone else?
Right.
Yeah, I guess not.
All right. Shall we
Actually,
wrap up?
I want to mention one other thing at the tail end here, because it's actually one of the comments that was just made. When societies become too big, feedback gets lost, so society flow probably gets harder. And it's one of the things that I think is interesting in looking at the heuristic mode, where the news cycle. It's actually fascinating when you see that the group societal reflection that we normally have is originally network news, and then cable news, and then internet news. It's trying to keep up, but it's still that single flow of the one truth is not sufficient to take care of the complexity that we have. We need to be able to fractalize and fragment the truth and be able to reassimilate it on the fly. And that's one of the things I think is the biggest driver behind the meaning crisis. This is the inability to be able to do that effectively, to be able to let it crumble when it needs to crumble, and then reassimilate on the fly as we're going. So it'll be interesting ways of thinking about that.
Yes, this actually relates to a conversation that me and Heather had in our course group about that's another shamanic technology, to be able to disassemble something into its parts and then reassemble it, specifically about anything to do with the mind, which in alchemy later was called solve et coagula, which literally means dissolve and reconstitute. So to be able to kind of partition your cognitive processes into separate things, and then have those things interact with each other and look at each other, and then reassemble it. And that actually relates to a comment that I wanted to make earlier but didn't get a chance to, is kind of reinvigorating these shamanic technologies for the modern age, because it's not the content that matters. Again, it's the process. And so the process of these technologies is the same. It's just we're interacting with new environments and new situations. And one thing though, disruptive technologies. So being able to disrupt our own cognition, to take a step back and recognize self-deception, recognize when we're stuck in a rut, or recognize when we're in a thinking pattern that isn't serving us, and to be able to get a fresh insight. So when we're talking about, for example, fake news, or being constantly bombarded with this information and kind of getting into this mode where we're stuck in it and unable to see through it, what kind of disruptive psychotechnologies can we use to take a step back? Not necessarily just unplugging from it, although that's one way to do it, but what are some of the other ways of altering our cognition, even in the moment, or like on short notice, without having to go into the forest, that we can do that?
I can say that, I've been going to a lot of conferences in the past few years that have this component of like group work. It's really emerged quite a lot, and it's very noticeable, especially in conferences that I've been to in Europe, with different types of psychotechnologies of how to enable certain types of conversations, while, intending a certain type of conversation and structuring it in such a way that only that type of conversation can happen. And so anyway, all I mean to say is that there's a lot of work being done, and there's multiple conferences and groups of people who are focused on them. DGov being one. This Emerge gathering I went to this weekend is another one. Like, there's just so many different practices that are being tested all the time. So maybe that's something that we can leave you with, like maybe going to these conferences and seeing them done in real time could be helpful.
Or circling groups, or any of these other we spaces. That's a kind of somewhat new term for me, we space.
Yeah, that was brought up a ton. It's like we saw it emerging when we were at DGov last year. It was just this new thing. It was kind of weird, and it was really experimental. And now it's just common language.
Yeah.
Like this last conference, it was just common. Everyone knew it. No explanation needed.
Yeah.
maybe we can bring that up in the next call when we've got time. Just discuss these different technologies, what they are. Maybe I can make a content piece about it. Because it's good for these types of group sense making calls, and whether they be offline or online, if you're in a group of people, they can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay,
Cool.
guys, I think that's about all the time we've got. But yeah, we will do this again, same time next week. Instead of doing the Zoom. What's that?
I noticed Carlos had. I noticed Carlos had his hand up. I'm wondering if you have time to take his question. Real quick
Go.
about it.
Go for it.
Oh, I didn't know I had my hand up. Yeah. So So about Vervaeke's this is episode 2, correct?
Yeah.
And he's talking about intuition, and basically my thesis is that it's based on Daniel Kahneman's work on thinking fast and slow. That is, we have 2 basic cognitive capabilities: something that's very fast, which is unconscious, and one is very slow, which is the conscious mind. And you'll see this crop up in the way Vervaeke structures cognition. At the top level is the propositional level, right, which aligns with the slow thinking, and the bottom level is the participational level, which aligns with the fast thinking, the intuition part. But in general, our entire cognition is basically moved by the intuition, and it's only rarely that we have the slow part come into play. So intuition is where we get all our biases, the cognitive biases. And there's this very nice cognitive bias codex that is on Wikipedia that actually shows like hundreds of different human biases. But what's interesting about that codex, you can divide it into 4 quadrants, and each quadrant sort of explains why you have this cognitive bias. And the 4 quadrants is one is that you don't have enough memory, you can't remember everything, right? The second one is there's not enough meaning in what you see. The third one is that there's information overload, and the fourth is that you need to be able to act very quickly. So all of those play into why you actually have these cognitive biases. And as human beings, we have this cognitive bias because the way we actually develop intuition is by experiencing the world. So it builds up as we start off as babies and how we interact. That builds up our intuition. That's how we are able to learn how to do things automatically. They become habits, so to speak. Unfortunately, this intuition has with it all this baggage, the cognitive biases that we have. And unfortunately, in this new 4th industrial revolution with information technology and AI, the systems, there's just too much information, and it overloads our cognitive capabilities. And that's why we have these. That's why we keep making these mistakes when we have, like right now in the American political scene. The problem is that there's information overload. Every day you have this new controversy, right? And people can't remember what happened the day before because there's just too much information. So they're unable to process it. And it's the nature of our cognitive capabilities being that of an intuition-based system, and we have all those biases. So it's something that is difficult to change because that's what we have as we grow up. At the same time, I guess what Vervaeke is eventually going to be saying is that you can sort of mold that so that you don't fall prey to all these biases. Now, there's certain biases that we can't fix at all. These are really low-level instinctual biases. And then there are higher level ones that we can, because they come from basically from culture and language. So even our languages, there are implicit in them biases, right? Certain languages are biased. Have preference to different genders, for example. And there's certain language that don't have any. And all that, because we live in those worlds where we have those languages, we're prone to those biases. And I think what Vervaeke is saying is that you can transition to a higher level. On the other hand, the problem to getting to the higher level is that you still use your lower level.
Yeah.
So you have to rearrange the lower level cognitive structures so that you can make that leap to the higher level.
Which actually ties into a very interesting comment from the chat that says, we see how groups of different values form competing ideologies. Does wisdom function within a particular value system, or can it transcend value systems? And this is, in spiral dynamics, that's called second tier thinking, where a person is able to have thinking or wisdom or whatever you want to call it that pulls from multiple value systems simultaneously and sees them as maybe not equally valid, but not contradictory. As sees them as kind of different parts of the same whole.
I think that's right. You can't have wisdom unless you have an exposure to different value systems, so to speak, right? Because if you're confined to a single value system and you try to develop wisdom out of that, then it's missing that other aspect that you've never seen before. How do you actually make that quantum leap when you've never seen the other value system? So there's a benefit to seeing diversity.
Yeah, and I think it also relates to what you were saying before with these kinds of different cognitive substructures that we have, some of which are very biased. We don't just transcend them and become without them. We transcend and include. So we're creating some sort of a higher order cognitive operating system that still includes the, old, slow, biased, inaccurate, whatever parts.
Yes, and I think what Vervaeke, I haven't really finished it. I sort of jumped to episode 25 because that was my interest. But so I have actually a gap from 1 to 25, but I started from 25 and I'm now at 35. But yeah, I think his what was my train of thought there? I missed my train of thought. What was it? Yeah, I forgot. You were saying.
Transcend and include old cognitive operating structures.
Oh, we can come back.
Yeah. We're actually over time. I think you jumped in late. We'd love to have you earlier. You always have interesting ideas.
Yeah, well, I mean, his lectures are really good. I mean, he is very structured and he builds it up. It's pretty complicated, actually. But he has the nice thing here is that I think this is one of the problems. We don't really have. I mean, in general, most people don't have a grasp of how people think. I mean, how do we actually think? And maybe at the most basic level is this idea of thinking fast and slow. We have these two cognitive modes. That's the most basic level. And Vervaeke actually goes into greater detail there and actually breaks it up into 4 different modes and expands that further, right? So by having a framework, meaning we have this shared understanding so that we can all basically work in the same space. Because a lot of times there's no, people have different perspectives on what cognition actually is. And then basically they're all talking past each other because we don't have the same, we're not working off the same playground. But the nice thing about Vervaeke is that he sets places together. This is the framework after 30 plus, I think it's going to be 50 lectures. This is the framework of cognition. And then you can work your way out to build basically solutions based on that framework. And it's not a framework that just came out of the sky. It's actually a framework that is validated by the latest cognitive science that's been developed over the past several decades. But that's a good thing about the lectures, right? It gives this scaffolding so you can discuss things in a structured manner or a guided manner, so to speak.
Cool.
Agreed.
All right, guys. Same time every week. We'll see you next Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot, guys. See y'all next week.
Ciao.